Is it a sin for a Christian to be a prepper? Well, I know that may sound like a little bit odd of a question, but I do think that there's a number of Christians who really struggle with this very question. Should they be preparing for things in the future to the point where they actually store things up, or would that somehow indicate a lack of trust in God? Well, it's a very real conundrum for many people, and so I thought I would look a little bit from the scripture that maybe will enlighten us to where we can see what God thinks about making prudent preparations. Now, when I say prudent, I want to emphasize that. In the New Testament, Jesus gives the parable of the man who tore down his barn so he could build bigger ones because his harvest was so big. He thought, if I had a bigger barn, I could store it there, and then I could just take the rest of my life easy. And Jesus, in the parable, said, the master said, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. And the reason was because he was being rich towards himself, but not towards God. He wasn't giving consideration to God. And so we do know that if we prep to the point where we're storing up many things for many years, that we're probably going too far. And especially if we start looking at the source of those preparations as our own intelligence and our own strength. If we make proper preparations, we're doing so from the perspective of, I want to be prepared so that I can serve God to the best of my ability for as long as I possibly can. But if we are prepping so that we can take life easy, and we're thinking that we're doing it all on our own, well, this is a sin. So that part would certainly be sinful. And there's another part as well. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about our need to trust in God and not worry about things such as what we're going to wear, what we're going to eat, or just on and on and on. He points out that God knows that we need those things. And then he talks about how he even provides the birds of the air with food and clothes the lilies of the field. And so we're not to get to the point, if we are preparing, to do so in such a way that it's because we're worried that God may not be able to provide for us in an adequate way. If you prepare to the point where you're minimizing your trust in God, it's a mistake. In that same Sermon on the Mount, Jesus pointed out that we need to be praying to God daily for our bread. Give us this day our daily bread. Do you do that? Or do you think because your pantry is full that you don't need to do that, you just won't bother God with that? Because this prayer to God for our daily sustenance is an indication that we realize, first of all, where it's coming from, and we're thankful for that. But we're also very much aware that without God, we really don't have anything. And so if you get to the point where you're preparing because you're worried that God won't take good enough care of you, or if you're preparing to the point that you're doing so just so that you can take it easy, then you're going in the wrong direction. But I believe there is a right direction, and I also believe that direction is very clearly spelled out within Scriptures. And I want to start with a passage in Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 6, where it says, "Go to the ant, you sluggard, and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest. How long will you lie there, you sluggard? When will you get up from your sleep?" Well, think about that. God has programmed within even the insects or bugs, whatever you call an ant. I don't know the proper technical word, I admit. But if God has given enough common sense to the ant that it stores up when the time is favorable for storing up because it sees a time when it's not going to be able to do that, then what about us? Remember, he says, go to the ant and be wise. We can learn from what the ant does. The ant gathers when it's time to gather. And whether it can actually intellectually see the winter coming or it's just something that God has programmed within it, and therefore in its actions, we really couldn't say, could we? We just know that God has the ant store up its food when the food is available for the times when it's not available. And so I suppose that when you go to the Bible, you see that even ants are preppers from that perspective. It's instructive to note what they do. They store up when it's time to store up for a time that they won't be able to. In other words, they store up during the winter and the harvest, in the summer and in the harvest time for the winter that's going to come. But they don't store up for the next summer or for 3 winters in advance. They just take care of what they need to take care of for today. That's the way God's programmed them. Well, we're not programmed, are we? We're able to make our own decisions. We're able to rationalize things out, hopefully in the proper way. I realize that many times our rationalization goes in a very destructive direction, but we can do it right. We live in unsettled times. I don't know that there has been a time as uncertain as the one we live in now as there has ever been in my lifetime. I think you just about have to go back to the Great Depression and World War II to find a time that's anywhere close to as uncertain as the time we live now. For those who were going into that time, they found that it was very prudent to be prepared, to have a little bit stored up. And I think that we probably need to be doing that. It's a personal decision. But I'm convinced for myself and for my family that there does need to be some prudent thought given as to the future. Why? Well, it's not just so that we can exist. We are put here on earth to serve God. And any preparations that we make need to be with that service in mind. And when we see times of uncertainty, hopefully we can realize that during those times we may have some difficulty in obtaining some of the things that are readily obtainable now. It's summer right now. It's harvest time right now. And it's prudent, I believe, to gather up a little for the winter that's sure to come. And as a result of that, we can continue to serve God to the best of our ability. Now, how far do we go? A lot of people go back to Daniel's time to Joseph's time, and they'll talk about the 7 good years and the 7 lean years in Egypt. And they'll talk about the fact that during the 7 good years, they stored up 7 years worth of food for the 7 lean years, but that's not what Joseph did. What Joseph did was he had them store up 1/5 of the great produce during the good years, and they did put that in storage facilities. But it was just 1/5. After 7 years of 20% annual production, he had probably saved up about 1.4 years worth of production for the lean years. They were still going to have to work during the difficult years. They weren't doing it so they could take it easy later on. They were doing it so that they could have that supplement to carry them through with the other activities that they would be performing when food was not as readily available. God was the one who designed this, by the way, and God had perfect wisdom, and God had them do it exactly right. We don't always have that luxury, do we? We can be praying to God for wisdom, and I'm convinced He'll give it to us. In James chapter 1 and verse 5, it commands us to pray for wisdom to God, who will generously give to all without finding fault. And so be praying for wisdom, and that will help you in this decision, first of all, whether to prepare or not, but secondly, how much to prepare. There's not a bad time where you just have nothing available, at least not for great lengths of time. Obviously, when a hurricane comes, you can't go out and get any food during the time that you're recovering from that, but the recovery period is fairly short. During the Great Depression, the recovery period was fairly long, but they still had the ability to do some work and to get some food and some provisions. For those who had stocked up a little bit in advance, they were prepared. There were a lot of people who learned from that, by the way. Our grandmothers and grandfathers who went through that learned to can their goods. They'd already started doing that well before the Great Depression, but now they could see the reason for it, and they were a little bit more prudent, a little bit more strategic in that. I believe we need some of that prudence and that strategizing. But again, I don't believe it needs to be with the idea that you can just get enough to where you don't have to worry. We don't worry, obviously. Maybe the better phrase is we don't try to get enough so that we no longer have to trust in God. Because our daily life is a walk of trust before God. In the moment that you start trusting in your own preparations, well, you've gone too far. But if you're using that as a steward of God's resources with the intent that you're not going to be part of the problem if things do fall apart, and that you're going to be able to help others along the way, then I think you're doing right. Those of you who are of my generation have to admit that the generations below us aren't thinking of this right now. We might have to stock up and prepare for more than just ourselves and our spouses. We may have to actually do a little preparation for our families. Do that. That's fine, as long as you're doing it through the lens of service to God. And you can also store up so that you can help your neighbors to the point that you can. My point behind prepping is this. If you're doing so just to physically survive, you're doing it for the wrong reasons. But if you're doing it so that you can survive to the point where you can serve God as you're surviving, and you're never losing sight of the fact that it's God who gives all the blessings. Joseph knew that the 7 years of abundance were from God, and that the provisions they made for the next 7 years were from God. Don't lose your trust in God. But also don't have some kind of a welfare mentality. Jesus points out that God feeds the birds of the air, but it's instructive to note that he doesn't throw the worms into their nest. He just provides the worms for them to go out and get. And the early bird still does get the worm. There's still certain responsibilities on that worm when it comes to work. We don't need to be a sluggard. We need to wake up from our sleep and get to the work that God has for us. And so, as far as answering the question, is prepping a sin? From what I can study and read about in the Bible, I would have to say absolutely not. As a matter of fact, in some instances, it's commanded. But if you use your prepping to the point where you're no longer trusting in God, then I would say, yes, it's a sin. And if you're doing it to the point to where you don't ever have to do anything for God ever again, then for sure it's a sin in that area. Is prepping a sin? To the best of my knowledge, it is not. It's prudent. But that you can go too far. And so in this area, as in all areas of life, we need balance. And that's up to you and up to me for our own lives to determine what the proper balance is. Be praying to God for wisdom as you make those determinations. And then just serve Him to the best of your ability. You'll do fine. That's it for today. Again, I appreciate your tuning in. I hope these ideas give you something to think about. But until next time, I pray that God will bless you richly as you seek to serve Him to the very best of your ability. God bless.